So I've read 2 sapphic vampire books this year with Carmilla vibes. Hungerstone was written with an expert hand. There's a lot of things it's executing at a very high level and doing interesting things with, but overall I feel like I was let down by the speculative elements, particularly the vampire things. Like, I just needed more supernatural than we were getting, and even though I love a slow burn, this was a little bit too slow a burn for me. And Bury Your Bones in the Midnight Soil by V.E. Schwab, on an uncomplicated level, was something I really enjoyed, especially when it comes to the vampiric supernatural lore element, which you could see a spoiler-free review of in my July reading wrap-up. But both Hungerstone and Bury Your Bones in the Midnight Soil put a spotlight on the plight of women throughout history, specifically for lesbian sapphic women over time. And I kind of think that a lot of folks don't necessarily believe that we need a specific examination of lesbians when vampirism and queerness has kind of been very intricately tied together for a while, especially for fans of Anne Rice's vampires, where Anne Rice has more or less taken all kinds of different poly and intimate looks at relationships for vampires. But I do think it's really worth examining lesbians specifically through the lens of vampirism, because historically they've had a double yoke of both being a woman, which was a subjugated person, as well as having a sexuality that wasn't approved by the mainstream. So where, like, gay men could choose not to marry if they wanted to, or they could marry someone for propriety's sake and then just never touch that woman and there'd be nothing that woman could do about it. A woman was married off against her will, and what she did or didn't do in that marriage bed was up to her husband, not up to her. So there's just like a lot of power dynamics and different difficulties that we have to engage with when we talk about women and lesbianism specifically. Hungerstone does a beautiful job showcasing the frustration of women in these roles. Spoilers here, but Hungerstone does so well showcasing Lenore's suffering that she viciously and brutally murders Henry by ripping his throat out. And it's such a graphic and primal thing that other people who come across his body believe he was attacked by his own dogs. And even after that unrepentant, violent burst, the reader is still rooting for Lenore. You know, I walked away believing that Lenore didn't have a lot of choice when it came to how she handled Henry. For Lenore to be free, for her to be happy, for her to live outside an asylum, she had to murder this man. And if she did it in a particularly gruesome way, I couldn't regret his end. A popular phrase is some variation of the form supporting women's wrongs as well as their rights. And it's our way of saying we love an empowered baddie as much as we love a virtuous, upright woman. That expecting women to be pure and righteous and role models at all times is in and of itself a form of sexist misogyny. And to this end, it's very easy to support Lenore's wrongs. She does kill not just Henry, but also her best female friend. There is a little bit more ambiguity about that girl's death. But at the same time, we see how both of these people have confined Lenore and are keeping her miserable and slowly killing her. It makes Lenore's wrongs very easy to support and get behind and champion. Bury Your Bones in the Midnight Soil has 3 major female characters: Maria/Sabine from 1532, Charolette from 1827, and Alice from 2019. And I do feel like each of them is expressing a version of women's wrongs. And while people feel a lot more conflicted about supporting these, I am here to argue about why you should be down with it anyways. Because I do think Bury Your Bones in the Midnight Soil is asking readers to celebrate a couple baddies and providing a rich contextual feel of the sapphic and the monstrous for closer examination and reading throughout time. I do think the evolving view of women and queerness in society makes these 3 women with very similar origins have different personalities and makes me feel very differently about each of their plights. So today I want to take a deeper look at Bury Your Bones in the Midnight Soil and what it has to offer us about vampires, queerness, and society. Starting with a brief rest stop at vampire and queerness in literature to do Bury Your Bones in the Midnight Soil and its subject matter of toxic lesbian vampires justice, we do have to talk about vampirism and how it's been used as a metaphor through queerness in literature just generally. This is not an exhaustive discussion. It barely scratches the surface as like a very light primer, really just meant to season and flavor the meat of this this video. But vampires have historically been used as a metaphor for otherness in society. If you look at something like a classic Dracula, you're going to see the otherness there was the foreigner or the non-Englishman. But because vampires feed on human blood and they sort of like come to their victims in the night, there is an inherent level of sexuality tied into the vampire. You know, taking another person's blood is kind of an intimate act, and the fangs sinking into human flesh sort of mimics heteronormative sex, and especially so if the femme person happens to be a virgin. And that's long fed into discourse around consent and assault and toxic masculinity, which is a whole other route we could go with the vampires that we're not doing today. But because vampires have been paired up with otherness and sexuality in some way, shape, or form throughout time, they have also sort of inherently become a queer-coded monster. Like, vampires often are known for their deception, their ability to walk among people and be just like them, but actually be a monster inside waiting to lure you to your demise, which is like one of the many negative stereotypes that queer people have had to endure historically. But even if you're not bought in by these connections I'm making, you should know that works like Carmilla that predate Dracula are specifically about a sapphic vampire-human relationship. Queerness and vampires were so intertwined that Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire, a seminal work that we hail as like a queer family with Louis Lestat and Claudia being the nuclear gay family taking care of their child, that was not Anne Rice's intention when she wrote it. She got that feedback from her readers and ran with it and like affirmed how they saw the text. That was not the original intention. That was something she did at a subconscious level. That's like how intertwined these things are. But talking about Louis and Lestat, they have like a super toxic relationship. The two of them in fact were fighting before Lestat baby traps Louis by turning Claudia and forcing him to stay and take care of their girl, which all sort of shows that while vampires are usually queer, they're also usually quite toxic, which gives like this both celebration of representation and at the same time having this baggage of all these negative stereotypes and pitfalls found within. And when push comes to shove, the truth of the matter is that vampires are monsters. Their immortal, eternal relationships are bound to go through various cycles of abuse, destruction, and negativity. Because when you have forever, what else is there but to go through all of it? You know, I love the Louis Lestat relationship, but it's certainly not aspirational. And there is this love-hate relationship with the empowerment becoming a vampire gives someone to truly be themselves, to truly fully live and explore, but also to do terrible things and be something that is inherently terrible. And this sort of like reflects the potential self-loathing that people might feel when they realize that they are queer, or when they're dealing with those queer thoughts and feelings and sort of coming to a self-acceptance, self-identity. And of course, the idea of mashing up vampires and queerness together in this metaphor like this does reinforce negative societal ideas of what it means to be queer. And even though historically the queer community as a whole has celebrated this representation and really identified with aspects of the vampire, there is definitely significant baggage that comes with it that might lead people to asking if overall this is a net positive or a net negative. But as someone who is constantly asking, but why not vampires, I do see a lot that's empowering about the queer vampire narrative that you might want to retake as a member of that group. For example, you get to go from marginalized prey to empowered predator. You get to be beautiful and powerful and androgynous and live out all of those outfit goals that you had. You get to be you and unrepentantly so. You're free of all of that societal stigma that was holding you down and maybe making you feel bad about something that was natural. And when society is rejecting you, when everyone is telling you you're less than human, you're monstrous, you're bad, you're wrong, why not really become the monster and at least gain the benefits of such a title? Why not pursue happiness and stability outside of the confines of society? Why not be a vampire? Why not go out and get your own? Which rolls us into a close examination of each of these three characters, starting with Maria/Sabine. Chronologically, we first meet Maria, later called Sabine, which don't worry, we'll get to that, in 1532. Despite being from a larger family and being born in Spain, Maria really reminded me in a lot of ways of V.E. Schwab's other work, The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, and the titular character of Addie. Because both of these characters are wild and free, they have an indomitable spirit earth that is all their own. And I feel like they are these untamable, unknowable characters that sort of defy society and all of the confines they try to squish them into. Maria happens to live in a more traveled town than Addie did, so she has the luxury of seeing a couple people coming and going, seeing a little bit more of life, and because she is in a larger family, she knows that she will definitely be married off, and so she makes plans for that instead of trying to like be owned by the town or whatever it was Addie was like mindlessly, idealistically trying to do. And I would say overall Maria is pretty clever because she picks a handsome guy who's rich who traveled through town and sort of like charms him and convinces him to come back for her when she's a little older. Only this doesn't work out. Maria's husband is controlling and abusive, gives her a horse that she is never allowed to use. She's not even allowed out in the farmland and estate that he owns. We're treated to several passages of this husband assaulting her in fairly graphic details, so content warning for that. And the one bright spot in all this is Maria's growing relationship with her personal servant, and this is sort of like her sexual awakening, only she can't even really explore her new crush because it doesn't look like these feelings are reciprocal, and Maria is in a position where she could force the matter, but she's not exactly given time to both recognize what this is and go ahead and take those extra steps because her husband is called to the war front, and when this happens she is shipped off to go live with her in-laws, a mother-in-law who hates her and is very bitter and angry, and a pervy father-in-law that would like to get with her if he could. And Maria has to say goodbye to the personal servant at this point in time because her husband marries her off to a stable boy and they'll never see each other again. So while Maria is living in the city, even more stifled than before, feeling trapped and hopeless, she ends up seeing a widow, someone who she'd seen a decade earlier and looks physically unchanged. The two of them strike up a relationship, like minimally a friendship, but something that feels vaguely flirtatious. And as they get to know each other, the widow keeps encouraging Maria to leave her husband. And Maria keeps being like, I don't really have that option. But things come to a head one night. Maria busts out and goes to the widow saying she's changed her mind and that she wants to be free. Maria thinks the widow is going to give her a poison to give her husband and this is how freedom's going to come. But instead, without explaining anything, the widow viciously assaults Maria because, surprise, she's a vampire. And Maria thinks that she is dying. She thinks she's been betrayed yet again by another one of her plans, another of her decision to trust someone. It's just always happening like this. She's always a fool and always getting put in an even worse scenario than she imagined. And that's when the widow offers her her own wrist to drink from. Maria greedily sucks down all of that life. In fact, she does not stop when the widow asks her to, and she drains this woman to dust, which is as metal as all get out, and I love it. And for me within the novel, this is Maria's defining moment because she's been cruel and impetuous and like a fully fledged human, but a little bit of a mean one until now, but she's also been dealing with a lot, so I was giving her some grace and empathy. But her response to killing the widow like this is just to sort of shoulder shrug and move on. And I was like, oh, we're dealing with a real one. This girl is a baddie and she is ice cold. It was not at all what I expected, but I loved it even more for the subversion of like the insta regret moment. Because why regret it? This woman had ostensibly betrayed her by not talking her through this a little bit more. Maria thought she was getting murdered. Obviously, she's gonna take all that she can get and cling on to life with both hands. And there's nothing you can do with regret. You can only go forward. You can't go back. So respect where respect is due. And FYI, this is where Maria changes her name to Sabine, and I'll be calling her Sabine from now on. So Sabine's lived all of her life under this might makes right banner, and now she finally has the might. So she goes back to her husband's house, murders him, murders the lecherous husband, murders the mother-in-law, burns the whole place down, and gets out of town. She takes shelter in a barn and wakes up to a farmhand the next evening, who she promptly kills. And then she goes up to the farmhouse and manipulates the wife to let her in so she can murder and eat her too. And I think it's this moment for most people where Sabine goes out of her way to go up to the farmhouse, manipulate this woman to get her inside by like sort of gaining her trust, sort of bribing her, and then viciously murdering her that loses a lot of folks. Because if it hadn't been cleared by her lack of remorse when she killed the widow, if you had felt like her burning down the house house and killing the husband and his family was justice or revenge, this would be the first time we'd be face to face with what is the monster. And we do want women angry. We want them avenging. We want to celebrate women's wrongs, but only the right kind of wrong. If they're too wrong, if it's too much about women killing other women, if their wrongness looks too much like maintaining the patriarchy, then we end up condemning these women as becoming the abuser, and we no longer want to support what they're doing. And if that's not enough, we also want to police how other people read the text or feel comfortable saying about it. And if y'all want to hate that when Sabine finally gets power, she uses it to serve herself, and that in her own way, Sabine is making women's lives worse and more dangerous, I'm totally not going to argue with you. I see the vision. And you know what? You're not wrong. But I would offer that moralizing Sabine like this is sort of dismissing her and her function in the story and doesn't necessarily serve anyone. Because Sabine is a vampire. She is not human. And when she was human, she was not that great. For her to come out of this transformation even more of a baddie, owning her own wants and desires and passions, being cruel and domineering now that she is the one with the power, all of that makes perfect sense. Human morality no longer applies to her. Do we ask other fictional vampires to play by human rules? And when you look at vampires, do you hate them because they're evil, or do you love them because of the evil? Why do we demand that Sabine continue to champion human women when she is no longer human, when we don't ask this from other vampires? I love watching Sabine. I'm rooting for her the whole time and celebrating her the same way I do when I read about a female serial killer. Obviously, I don't think women serial killers are morally superior to male serial killers. And in general, I would say serial killing is bad, or even stunning take, I'm sure. But the rareness of a female serial killer at all is something that intrigues me and makes them more compelling and interesting to see the feminine take on it, or to see that female serial killer embody the masculine role while still maintaining their femininity. I don't expect the female serial killer to somehow even out all the male serial killers that are out there in the world. I don't expect that female serial killer to get revenge on all the bad men for me, nor do I think vampires or serial killers are capable of this. Because when you kill someone, whether a vampire or serial killer, you're after a victim, an individual, and the patriarchy is a systematic oppressive form. So like you can't get back at or fight against them on this individual level. That was never an opportunity for us. I don't know why we're looking for it. And why does violent crime of any sort have to follow some kind of pre-prescribed gender role? From my perspective, the idea that a female vampire would be more interested in male victims feels a little heteronormative. Doesn't it make more sense for a woman who is attracted to women to inherently find more interest in female victims? Doesn't being free from that traditional power structure, knowing that men can no longer control you, sort of make them look entitled and little and silly? Like, I imagine the way Sabine viewed men after she was no longer like subordinate to them, the same way we might today look at like a red pill podcast host. Like, he's angry and entitled and thinks that he gets to have women because he exists, not because he treats them well, not because he's a great man, not even because he has resource, just because he is a man and they are women. And from that perspective, seeing him as little and shallow and not even worth killing makes perfect sense to me. Of course, women live richer, more complex, deeper lives, and if you can taste that in the blood, of course they're the preferred victim for Sabine. What is that saying? Ignoring someone is the best form of vengeance? That's more or less what I see Sabine doing. She is above threat from any of these men any longer. We can, of course, talk about Sabine and Charlotte's relationship. Its bones are okay. I think they start with a mutual respect, love, and care. But it becomes both controlling and abusive in nature. And if that kind of like disgusted you and you're not a big fan, I understand. But at the same time, these aren't human relationships, they're vampires, and things always go south. Because if they were happy being good forever, like, why will we even be reading it? It is interesting to see how violence and manipulation that have been done to Sabine in her human years and a little bit in her vampire years, she returns on to Charlotte. There's something to be said about a cycle of abuse there, about her cunning ability to learn and develop like worse strategies than those that were employed on her. And too, in that regard, it might transgress above what we could typically forgive or overlook in vampire society, because it does seem very intentional and cruel and calculated and cold in a way we don't often see in like abusive abusive vampire relationships, but also within the context of the lore of bury your bones in the midnight soil, vampires also have an expiration date. They're not immortal like we usually think of them, and what they are losing is their mind. Like, that's literally rotting, parts of them are decaying and being lost. And Sabine, like, actually describes that happening to her in one of the passages, so we do have to wonder if by the time she reaches Charlotte, and certainly by the time she starts abusing Charlotte, which even by Charlotte's own admission is quite down the road of their relationship, is that intentional abuse, is that cold calculation, manipulation that reveals who Sabine has always been and like this new, more intense cruelty edge? Or is this like a result of dementia, her decay, and rot just hurting everything around her? Like the viciousness, the bloodlust, that is like her strongest element. That's what she keeps, and she's losing other parts that give her more empathy and capacity to love. And I know readers as a whole had a bunch of different complicated feelings about how they viewed Sabine's transformation into a vampire and what she did with her vampiric feelings, but I do think it's quite self-evident she suffered a lot as a human, and every time she tried to like get something for herself, everything went bad. So it feels very natural to me that as a vampire now, with the power to enforce what she wants, she would be vicious and cunning and self-serving and more than happy to be self-reliant and like out there on her own, doing her own thing without any companionship at all. When Sabine becomes a vampire, for me, it's this triumphant, wonderful moment. It's like a celebration. If they're going to demonize her, if she's going to be treated terribly, why not be a vampire? Why not take up the mantle of monster and at least get the boon of being the demon? I do think there's a bit of missed opportunity because we only get Sabine's limited third-person perspective for like her history before she meets Charlotte, and Charlotte takes over telling the story and we never get to look back at Sabine again. But I'd have loved if Sabine shared some of her insight about society and humanity over time. Maybe it's like easier for her and Charlotte to be out in the open companions at some points versus others, or she observes it's easier for Charlotte to get a girlfriend at some points than it was previously. I don't know, there's part of me that loves her toughness, loves her embrace of who she is, even if that's the villain, but I would like that acknowledgement that like her time period and her circumstances is part of what shaped her, and I think she could have driven that more clearly if we'd just gotten a couple perspectives from her in the future. Although to be fair, because she is mentally rotting, she might be too far gone for these observations, and if we'd made it too clear that she was still thinking and feeling, some of her like monstrous looming in the back part of the story wouldn't have worked as well. Which moves us into Charlotte, or Lottie, and for the purposes of this review I'm calling her Charlotte. Sorry all those Lottie fans out there. She's our second vampire and she died in 1827, and already we can see her circumstances are a lot different than Sabine's. Because she's sheltered, effusive, she loves books and reading and writing in a way that Sabine always scorned. She's very sensitive and empathetic, wears her heart on her sleeve as it were, and she has a crush on her childhood best friend that she is attempting to explore. You know, queerness might still be deeply frowned upon at this time period, she might have a lot of uphill struggles, but she still found a way to know her own mind, her emotions, and to fall in love. And if Sabine is like embodying all of the brutality that you could see in like a portrayal of Lestat, one of her seminal vampires, like he's very vicious, he's cunning, he loves a good kill, then I think Charlotte is all of like Lestat's softer moments because she loves art, humanities, the way that Lestat does. After she becomes a vampire, she just seems to love and empathize with humans, even now that she's the monster. The same way that Lestat, quote unquote, only kills murderers. She has this loneliness and longing that drives Lestat into the ground, that drives him to make Louis, that even drives him to make Claudia. All these self-destructive, impetuous decisions Lestat makes, you can see the same road of destruction in Charlotte's need for companionship. And even though we don't get this information from Sabine, I assume that part of the reason she takes Charlotte under her wing is she sees a little of herself in this girl, even if this girl's far more sheltered and innocent than she is. And also, Sabine has learned a lot from other vampires, and in particular, she spent a long time in Venice with Matteo, who had a human companion, and I sort of think like Sabine saw what companionship could offer and thought she could do it better by actually turning her companion into a vampire. To be honest, we don't get a lot of Charlotte's time as a vampire. It's sort of glossed over as like she starts being a vampire and is horrified by the killing people thing, which drops some vampire lore on us because until now, I had considered that as soon as you go vampire, you've got a taste for blood and you're cool with killing because all the other turned vampires we see are immediately fine with it. But now we can reflect on how Sabine took her transformation and realize that was like unique to her the same way Charlotte's horror is unique to her own personality. But Charlotte does go along with killing for the sake of love, which argues to me she's not that bothered. Like, it's a little icky to her, but it's not really a moral hard line because she prefers companionship to not and will do anything to keep it, which is kind of a precursor to what happens in the back third of the book I'll jump to in just a sec. But they have a loving relationship for a long time, and then slowly Sabine's mind starts to crumble and she starts to become more possessive and abusive, and she manipulates Charlotte into a position where she promises never to hurt Sabine so she can't even fight back when these situations arise. All of which culminates in Charlotte fleeing Sabine and sort of being on her own for a while. And you might think because of the lack of details on Charlotte's vampiric time, we can't say a lot about Charlotte's life as a human being queer versus Charlotte's life as a vampire being queer, but that would be wrong because Charlotte gets this really nice moment where she returns to her home manor and finds her old childhood friend who had married her brother, and she's super old now. She thinks she's hallucinating when she sees Charlotte, and she starts talking to her where she more or less apologizes for her being so scared after the kiss they had, her saying that she like returned Charlotte's feelings and wished she had been brave enough to act on them then. So in comparison, we can see that Charlotte has had this lovey-dovey life of travel and romance with Sabine, lived a full human life being who she is and enjoying it, while her friend has lived a life that's actually driven her to repeatedly seeing hallucinations of a young Charlotte and repeatedly apologizing for not pursuing this relationship. We can see that being human and queer leads to regret. Choosing the monster is the right call for Charlotte. Even though there is some trauma involved with it, there's some hurt feelings, there's some uncomfortable tidbits, and she does eventually go into an abusive relationship here, it's still the better option. And Charlotte's life as a vampire is charmed even though the lifestyle doesn't agree with her sensibilities as much as it does someone like Sabine. For example, after Charlotte flees Sabine, Charlotte runs into this human girl she falls in love with called Giada, and eventually she confesses to Giada not only that she loves her, but that she's a vampire, and Giada accepts both things and they end up being in a relationship together. That is like, I don't know, one of Charlotte's bright moments in like her long life of fleeing Sabine. No difficulty in this relationship for Charlotte. Giada wants to be turned into a vampire, Charlotte turns her down, and Giada still loves and accepts her. The one moment there's even like a bump in the road is when this old man yells at them for being lesbians on the side of the road. And that makes Giada really upset because Giada's probably experienced some form of discrimination before now and sort of understands the kind of threat implicit in that. But Charlotte doesn't get any of that because she is beyond the point where this man could threaten her, and I don't think she really faced any adversity for being a lesbian before now. Like, people told her it would be hard and sort of like encouraged her to pick a husband, but no one was like calling her slurs or whatever. And I think it's this moment where you get to see a little peek at the level of extreme privilege Charlotte's gotten to live because of when Sabine picked her to become a vampire and then how her vampire fairy tale's gone from there. Which, like, I'm happy for Charlotte in some ways that she found an escape hatch and didn't have to do unnecessary suffering, but her like privilege here and inability to connect with other people's hardship and struggle sort of creates blinders for her where she feels like her own needs and being herself is all she's required to do. So this leads to Sabine catching up with her and killing Giada and sets Charlotte off running again. But Charlotte continues to take girlfriends and lovers despite the threat she knows Sabine poses to them. And eventually this catches up to her. Sabine starts killing girlfriends, which does not stop her from taking them. It just makes her move place to place hoping to stay ahead of it. And then eventually she takes a girlfriend that Sabine turns into a vampire instead of killing. And I think perhaps in her own way, Sabine's attempting a vampire family. Like, the three of them could all travel the world together as lovers. And just as Lestat uses the constant threat against Claudia to keep Louis in line, Sabine could use the constant threat against Charlotte's new lover to keep Charlotte in line. But we never really get to figure out what the plan was because Charlotte kills this vampire lover. She claims claims she does this to spare the girl from experiencing the same degeneration in her lover that Charlotte experienced when Sabine started to go a little crazy. But I mean, she could have asked her girlfriend what girlfriend wanted, and as Charlotte has access to a larger vampiric community, she could have provided her girlfriend these same resources, which would have helped protect her girlfriend from a fate similar to what Charlotte endured with Sabine. Because the girlfriend could have gone to the vampire community and they could have dealt with Charlotte when she started losing her marbles. Or like, who knows, maybe her and the girlfriend would have broken up before then and gone their separate ways. And either way, they'd have had years and years and years together before that happened. I think it's the girlfriend's choice to decide if she wants those years or not. And also, Charlotte could have like just broken up with this girlfriend and left her, and then she also wouldn't have had to suffer Charlotte's degeneration. She didn't have to murder this girl. So Charlotte's selfishness and self-appointed keeper of the right way sets into motion the loss of hundreds of girls, including Alice. And she refuses to take even an iota of accountability for this, or even to provide these girls with some form of informed consent or decision, which as far as I can tell, Sabine provided her the most informed consent about vampirism out of anyone that we've seen get turned so far. So in some ways, Charlotte is actually worse than the monstrous Sabine when it comes to turning and killing girls. Which means we finally get to talk about Alice, who died in 2019. And she is the tragedy of this piece. Because our world isn't perfect or equal for everyone, but as same-sex dating and marriage has become way more normalized, Alice has a lot of options that don't involve becoming a vampire. Like, in her case, she's the first time in the story I'm not thinking, but why not vampire? While Alice is in a similar age range to both Sabine and Charlotte, she feels a lot younger because we've like extended adolescence and adulthood in modern times. And in some ways, she is really just getting started by choosing an Ivy League college to major in engineering. Her setting out on her own like this is the first time she's making an adult decision and the first time she's really starting her own path. And an engineering degree is like a good degree. She seems quite talented. So in that regard, I'm mourning not just for Alice, but for like this book society as a whole, because it feels like she had a plan where she was really going to contribute to the world and do positive things. And even more so, I just felt awful for Alice's family. The father has already suffered the loss of his first wife and the loss of his oldest daughter. And now, just as he was like securing a good future for Alice and seeing her go off into the world like stronger and capable, she's also dead. The stepmom has worked since her introduction into this family to sort of like bridge the gap between these stepdaughters, herself, and her relationship with her husband, and it had really poor success rate with this daughter, Caddy, and seemed significantly more promising with the work that she had done with Alice. And I think Alice really loved her, really appreciated her contributions too. They were finally kind of in a position where they could have that kind of relationship because Caddy's out of the picture, and perhaps enough time had gone by since Caddy's death that they could sort of mourn it appropriately, but also move on with their lives after that, which I hate to think about Caddy as something that you have to get over, but unfortunately, since her story ends there and we have to keep going, we need to bridge that somehow. And now not only has the stepmother like tried everything she could and lost Caddy and probably feels some kind of like guilt over her death, but Alice is gone too. This is like deeply tragic for her as well as Alice. Not to mention a very young stepbrother. It's always hard to lose a sibling. Alice is placing the same trauma on her stepbrother that was placed on her when she lost Caddy, except there's no fault here. And why was Alice turned? Because she was a one-night stand once for Charlotte. She's not special. There's no spark there that Charlotte and or Sabine saw in her. She wasn't chosen the way Sabine shows Charlotte. One line that says taste like sorrow. And that's all she was ever allowed to be as a human, because just as she was coming out of that, just as she was finding her footing, they killed her. And in a lot of ways, in this Sabine versus Charlotte struggle that Alice is just thrust in without her consent, it's very similar to the Caddy versus stepmom fight that Alice has just exited. And I think the practice she has in subduing her own thoughts and feelings and emotions really helps her when she has to face off against Sabine and keep all those thoughts internal and hidden. And I think both Sabine and Charlotte make the mistake of viewing Alice as young and meaningless, may be able to help them with their goals, but also easily discarded and replaceable if not. But Alice is someone who's been caught in a power play before, as someone who was seen more as a symbol than an individual all her life. Even like Caddy, I think, saw her as a connection to their mother, as a sister, as a loyalty to pull. And the stepmom also saw her as a bridging force to the like husband's life before their marriage, and you know, if she could make peace with these daughters, that was like her getting the blessing from the mother to move in like this. And now here with Sabine and Charolette, she's again just like a chess piece. I think it lets Alice evaluate their monstrousness and her own capacity with a more clear head. She knows Charolette killed that one girlfriend Sabine turned, and she knew that was a girlfriend she loved and had spent time with and was devoted to. So if she would do it once with a vampire she knew, she would do it again to Alice if given the chance. And I think Alice recognizes that wild, ruthless, unpredictable anger in Sabine as being sort of similar to what Caddy was keeping a fire for in her own heart, where she was just so angry at the world because her mother had died, because her mother was being replaced. She like couldn't see the narrative any other way. She couldn't live in a world without her mother. She's just struggling with it so much. And in some ways you can sort of see that same wrestle with Sabine trying to get Charolette back, needing Charolette to continue functioning. I think if left on her own, Sabine would have eventually gotten herself killed. And I think that insight into how Sabine is sort of like Caddy, dangerous and wild and ultimately bent towards destruction, sort of let Alice know she couldn't hitch her wagon to her either. So killing Sabine and Charolette changes nothing about Alice's situation. She's still a vampire mourning the loss of what she could have been if she'd been allowed to progress in her human life. But I think in some way this confrontation has helped her bury the last remaining ghost of Caddy, and I'm hoping that she's learned to speak up and take the space in the world that she deserves, instead of always being kind of hesitant and nervous to like reveal herself or to demand what she is worth. And I think deep down there is this spark buried for a happily ever after, because even after she's been turned, Alice does speak to her father, say that she loves him. And part of me really wants to fight for this ending that she wanted, for her to continue to go to engineering classes, and she can go out in the day even if it's hard, for her to feed the same way Charolette did by leaving her partners alive, and for her to like go back to her family and still live that life as best she can, until like a time comes when obviously as a vampire she goes on and these people meet old age. So wrapping this up, things are far from perfect in our world today, but looking at the place of women and queer women in specific, I do think how they relate to the monster of the vampire and whether or not it's better to choose the vampire or we're even rooting for the vampire has changed as society and times move forward. You know, because when I went from reading this story, starting with Sabine, I was like anxiously anticipating when she'd finally become a vampire and finally like rule the night. And with Charolette, I was kind of like fine with her vampirism. I felt like, yes, that was the better of the options, but she still did have options to live a probably okay-ish human life too. And then we get to Alice, and there's nothing but like sorrow and anger and resentment about her turning. And even within my own life, I think about the kinds of stories I've seen and read and the representation that's been available to me, and definitely in my childhood and teens, most queer representation, things were only queer-coded. They weren't directly stated to be queer, and usually it was villains. And now there's a lot more open representation and people get to play a majority of different roles. I think that's what we're celebrating, even if we're not where we want to be. We are so much further than where we were. And to a certain level, I think Bury Your Bones in the Midnight Soil is a triumph of this journey where we are so far, as well as like a reflection of how we've traveled, where we started and where we are now. Because queer characters do not need the mantle of monstrousness to exist. And we are in a place where we might feel sorry for such a tragedy instead of anticipation for the havoc they'll wreak once empowered. And we might be in a place where a lesbian vampire just gets to be a vampire, a baddie and unapologetic about it. Or they might have a moral conscience and seek to be the first vampire that feeds off of humans and doesn't kill them. Or they might be a vampire that would have been better off remaining human. But feel free to disagree with me in those comments down below. I would love to hear a bunch of varying perspectives on this specific novel and its place as a sapphic, toxic vampire story. The secret emoji today is going to be the lady vampire, and as always, keep reading.